Joanna Lloyd, how are you?
I am good, Rich. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I'm glad to have you. I believe what you're doing is very important, and it comes from a perspective that I think many people do not even consider. So I'm glad to be able to talk with you about it today and share a little bit of your life's journey with the audience and up until this point. So let me go ahead and give you a brief introduction for the audience. You are an artist, a birthing specialist, and a community host. You're the founder of Mumabuba and Echoes of Birth community, created to dedicated for pregnancy and baby wellness in Whit Sundays after 20 years of supporting moms and babies through home-based services. You're a specialist in complementary pregnancy care, offering expert support across fertility, pregnancy, birth preparation, postnatal recovery, and breastfeeding, shaped by personal experience and advanced specialist training. You're a certified lactation consultant, which combines clinical expertise with a deep personalization and understanding of breastfeeding challenges, offering empathetic and knowledgeable support to new mothers. You have extensive training in pregnancy therapies, and you hold qualifications in pregnancy massage, maternity reflexology, and birth psychology, providing holistic care during all stages of motherhood. And with over 20 years of dedicated experience since 2004, you have continuously expanded your skills and knowledge, passionately supporting positive birth and parenting experiences in both the UK and Australia. So, what I like to do, Joanna, is start off by asking my only scripted question, and that is, where were you born and what was life like as a kid for Joanna?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for the introduction. And I'm sure most of your listeners are probably thinking, hang on a minute, all that birth stuff, what's that got to do with art? So bear
Right.
with us. There is a connection. Keep
Yes,
listening.
yes.
So, what was life? I was born not far out of London in England, and I had an interesting early childhood. My parents separated, so I'm an only child. I was the firstborn, and they separated when I was 18 months old.
Oh, wow.
So my mum moved back in with my nan and granddad because she was also an only child. And back in those days, it wasn't as acceptable as it is now to be a single parent. There were the support mechanisms in place. So she went back and lived with my nan and granddad, and my mum worked. So I was very much brought up by my nan and granddad, realistically, than obviously, my actual parents.
Yeah.
My father was an interesting character, and the stories behind that, and I basically told him that I didn't want anything more to do with him when I was around the age of 10.
Okay.
So I've only actually ever seen him once since then in my life, which I think was around 17 from memory. So very little to do with my father. Because of that, and because of the divorce and separation, that kind of thing puts a stress on kids. Maybe not realized quite so much with children now because there is so much separation and divorce that happens, whereas that wasn't as acceptable back in the 70s, that it was more normalized perhaps nowadays,
Yeah.
whereas back then it was very difficult. And that the relationship between my parents and what happened clearly, and being an only child as a result, does and did have an impact on me as a kid.
Okay. And I would imagine as well going to school, elementary school, that may have caused you to maybe be a little bit less less open to engaging with some of the other kids, or did you find it a bit easier to do that?
I was very much somebody, all my school reports were all about she spends more time trying to help everybody else than she does doing her own work.
Okay.
So I was very much, and I think this is where, with my understanding, which I'm sure we'll come on to, around how our early days very much shape us, I was all about trying to please people. So what happened in my home life, at home, I was trying to keep the peace between parents, trying to please people, not trying to cause further disruption, especially in relation to my father. I have very distinct memories of never feeling adequate enough for him, feeling like a failure. So in my school life, I had to work very hard. I think now, with what we understand, I probably would have been diagnosed in more recent years with something like dyslexia. I
Mhm.
really struggled with reading. Anything academic was very hard for me. But I was always trying to help other people with their work, as I said, rather than doing my own. I wasn't up there with the major popular kids, but I
Right.
was always trying to make people happy, which is an interesting stem from your own private life. Because I think we know that kids will play out
Yeah.
what they need at home.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I'm assuming too, your mom had to work because of being
She
sick.
did, yeah.
What type of
Yeah.
work did she do?
And my mum, very early days, she worked for a travel company,
Okay.
but for the majority of my mum's working life, she was a legal secretary.
Okay. And how about your grandparents? What did they have any?
So my nan basically stayed at home, so she looked after me. She had worked for a very high company in London years and years, but then she suffered with agoraphobia, so couldn't go out of the house,
Oh, wow.
which led her to stay at home. So then, yeah, when mum moved back with my nan and granddad, yeah, I remember her walking me to school and back. She was the mother figure in that respect that is typical, without stereotyping, the typical mum stays at home while the male goes to work. And my granddad used to work for the British Post Office. So none of them had very high powered jobs, particularly. They were very run of the mill, keep life going type
Yeah.
positions.
Yeah. And just because I'm seeing scenarios of where different things are affecting mental status already in the conversation. Was there anything specific that you can potentially remember that maybe made your nan agoraphobic?
Not that I'm aware of. There may have been conversations that we've had previously, but my nan passed away a good 13, maybe even 14 years ago now.
Okay.
So, off the top of my head, I can't remember, but I think there was something, but I can't remember exactly what it was that triggered it. But there was something that did trigger it. But yeah, off the top of my head, I can't remember.
Gotcha. Do you remember as a kid having any creative aspects that were coming into play that kept you occupied or allowed you to explore maybe a different world outside of what you were experiencing at the house?
Yeah. And that's exactly where the art comes in. Yeah.
Okay.
Because I was not, as I said, I was never particularly academic. I really needed to work at what I did.
Mhm.
It didn't come easy to me. However, my the art was my outlet. And I don't remember in so what you would class as elementary, which is our primary, so
Yeah.
the lower
Yeah.
school.
Yeah.
But certainly within my high school, that was really where it became very evident. So I studied that with my end of school qualifications, and
Yeah.
I've still got art now that I drew, and that was my thing. I had a massive easel and it pencils because that was my main medium that I used was really high quality coloured pencils. My second was always clay, but they were my two favourite mediums. And my coloured pencils back all those years ago would, for how much I paid for them back then, which I think was a good couple of £100,
Yeah.
all those years ago, they were really good, expensive pencils, and I still have the box today.
Nice.
I
You
can't
can't
get
get
rid of
rid
it,
of them.
even though that's not what I do specifically now.
Yeah.
I've never been able to get rid of. I even have all my oil pastel, my oil paints, and yeah, it's a bit crazy, but I still have everything
Right.
from me that long ago.
When you moved into the high school era of your education, did you still have that tendency to want to help everybody else as well? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's never gone. And it's still, if you think about what it is I do now, which obviously will migrate as we move through the lifespan, I still do it now.
Yeah.
It is inherent in what I do and what I've always done.
And I'm imagining that a lot of that comes from the fact that you may not have got the help that you wanted or needed early on based on the family situation. So you were doing that to essentially replace what was missing in you. So you're doing something for others to generate that emotional worthiness, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a number of things that I've identified traits within myself. And I would say the biggest one for me is to feel wanted.
Yeah,
And I think that pleasing component of trying to help others was that feeling of being, being wanted and needed, because I think that I didn't feel wanted as very much as a child. And that, as I said, I certainly from my father's point of view, I never felt as though I was worthy. I was always considered a burden almost.
yeah,
And that kind of, almost as though I was unloved. If I went out anywhere with my father, he would very much say, "Oh, look at my daughter," and blah 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 blah. And then we'd get back home and it would be, "You're useless, you can't do anything." He would always dump me with my cousins, and I would very much get, you don't do things as well as he does, or you don't do this. So I was constantly put down. So I think that need to please people and that need to feel wanted was because I just did not get that when I
right.
was at home, and certainly from him.
Yeah, yeah. The the enjoyment and desire that you got from creating and focusing on art in high school, did that generate some thought that you might explore that further on after you finished high school?
Absolutely. So I did my two of my major qualifications in high school. So in England, we finish and we have a qualification at the end of year 10. And then we go on to do a different qualification for the end of year 12. So it's a little bit different, I believe, in the States as it
Yeah,
is here in Australia. They go straight the way through to year 12.
yeah.
So a little bit different in England, but I did those qualifications to year 10 and then did only art and design for up to year 12. So they were
Oh, wow.
much more intense qualifications. So you did 9 or 10 to year 10 and then 2 or 3 for year 12. So in much more detail. And
Oh,
it was always so I'd been doing some work individually, so creating pieces that I'd been selling to local friends and family. They said, "Oh, could you do this for us? Could you do that for us?" And my plan was to go to university to actually study interior design.
okay.
So not quite art in that respect. Back then, art was not, and I think still even now today at school, it doesn't get given the same status. Interior design was kept the artistic component, but was considered a little bit more, I don't know, more
Socially acceptable.
advanced. Yeah, absolutely. But I got to the end and I was like, you know what, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be in the education. I actually met my husband. So we first met when we were 13. So I moved out of London
Oh,
and
wow.
moved to a more rural area. We actually started seeing each other at 15 and got engaged at 17. So
Okay.
we've been together for a very long time. And he also has a design and art background.
Okay.
So he's not quite as art driven as me. His was more design.
Gotcha.
So he went to uni and did an industrial design degree.
Nice.
And I was like, okay, so I'm going to work. And I decided I was just basically in a retail supermarket because that's what I had as my kind of part-time job.
Yeah.
So I was doing that to give us a little bit of money and income just to support as a relationship.
Yeah.
And I moved my way up and was very much training people. So that kind of helping, pleasing people was still there.
Yeah.
And then when Martin, my husband, finished his degree, he'd said to me, okay, what do you want to do?
Nice.
Yeah, so he finished his degree and he said to me, what do you want to do? So at that point, I said, I want to go back to my art. So I started doing freelance greeting card illustration.
Oh,
I even got to the point of talking to a few card companies. But again, that's that how you describe that social acceptance.
yeah.
The nature of the way that I worked, it took me a long time to create one piece.
Okay.
And it was very much a case of this is never going to work as an income. Yeah, great to have as a hobby, but realistically, is this going to work as an income? So I was continuing part time with the retail supermarket. And at that point, I'd gained my positions in such a way that they then opened another store and asked me to support in actually recruiting and training everybody because I'd got to a training position.
Yeah.
And basically, cut a long story short, I became so involved in that art just took this back seat again.
Yeah.
And I ended up opening, I was flying backwards and forwards over to Ireland and supporting stores to open up over there, and then ended up becoming a human resources manager for the company and in a very big store. From that point of view, my art just dwindled away, which was sad
Yeah.
when you've got this job that's then bringing in money. And with that kind of people pleasing, I was doing very well. I was separated away from, because the art, it gave me an outlet. It gave me a way. Somehow, people talk about reading books and how books take them out to a place that is not in the here and now,
Correct.
that you
Yeah.
can immerse yourself and get away from the things that are bothering you. And because of, I never read a novel until I'd had my first daughter. Years
Yeah.
that I'd never done that because I would fall asleep, and because I jumbled up the words, it was never my my first ever book that I ever read was Harry Potter. So,
Oh, wow. Okay.
that was, yeah, but years after,
Yeah.
years after. So it was that outlet for me, and I never gained that within the work, unfortunately. And
Right.
I just absolutely buried myself within work because what the art gave me was an outlet and a way to escape. The work didn't. So the only way that I could compensate was to do more of it and bury myself in it. There was a different mechanism involved in the two forms of work, and how it alleviated essentially, what I know now were imprints and my nervous system constantly talking to me, that those two things very much changed.
Yeah, the amount of time that it took you to finish a piece, what do you think that was at that point in time? Was it the fact that you wanted to get it perfect, or you just wanted it to be yours versus something that was going to go out to somebody else?
Yeah, perfect. Because again, I can't let anything be seen. When I can remember and I can even remember the guy's name, Mr. Orsesi was my art teacher.
Okay.
And if you did something wrong, he would say, so use that, make that into something else.
Yeah.
Don't, whereas for me, it was always, it had to be perfect. And I think the clay was perhaps a little bit different. But certainly with most mediums, one of the reasons why with these particular pencils, my work was almost photographically perfect.
Yeah.
And that was why, and the nature of the pencils was I could layer upon layer, because they were quite almost waxy and you could really layer up on them. So for me, most of the art where, like I see and I look at people where they fill up a paint can and they just throw it and it creates whatever, that was not me. That
Yeah.
was not me. That
Yeah.
was not my style of art. My style of art was very controlled and very perfect, because anything I created couldn't be imperfect. It had to, and again, linking back, we know now
Yeah.
that very much reflected my childhood in that I couldn't make a mistake, because if I made a mistake, consequences would happen as a result of that. So they had to be perfect.
Yeah. I relate to that very much so. I've spent probably into my 30s trying to be perfect with
Mm.
everything that I was working on creatively. If it was a pencil drawing, I was the same way. I wanted it to be photorealistic or as realistic as possible versus whatever I was looking at. And I was striving to be absolutely perfect to the finest detail. I'd spend hours just on the eyes alone if I was drawing a face, just because I had to have that detail there. And I completely understand that very much. And it took me quite a few years to get to the point of finally realizing that perfection is not a human quality. And for the audience, the creative community, the quicker that you can realize that and understand that phrase, the easier it will be for you to move forward in the creative field or in life in general, because perfection it's not a human quality. You can never attain it. And yeah, it took me a while to get there. And also too, I can relate to working for a company that is seeing you doing well and promoting you quicker
Yeah.
than potentially anything else. Because I had the same scenario. I started out working for a company, and within 2 years, I was a manager. Within 4 years, I was running the store. So I definitely can relate to that. Once you moved into this position of HR, human resources, and the art starts taking the back seat and potentially eventually no seat at all for a period of time. What were your thought processes of working for this company? Did you think this is going to be a full-on career? with what you're doing with them?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So I'd worked to a position that I had pretty much one of the biggest stores.
Yeah.
There wasn't, unless I went regionally, which those positions didn't come up, there wasn't really anything else for me to do.
Okay.
But I was working around 72 hours a week and paid for 36. And because of it being retail, I was working Easter, Christmas, never really having time off, going in during the early hours of the morning, not seeing daylight, coming out at the end of the day, not seeing daylight. And from a health point of view, it was like, this is stupid. Like, I can't do this. This is not conducive to good health and general well-being. So I ended up leaving. I resigned. My store manager banged his head on the table. What the hell? I've just given you this huge pay rise. Where are you going? Who's poached you? And I was like, I haven't got anything. And so then that's at the point he's banging his head on the table going, what are you doing? This is insane. You're leaving this for nothing. And I was like, but I got to do something. This is not what I want to do. So I worked for a newspaper for a little short while, only a few months.
Okay.
And what I thought was my dream job came up because I had these kind of, at this point, art had left.
Okay.
So it wasn't in my remit. And I had these kind of companies that I was like, oh, if I could ever get a job with one of those, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
And I landed it. So I became a human resources manager for the police force.
Okay.
So this is where other things now start to weave in.
All right.
The fact of doing human resources was very much again about helping people
Yep.
because you were there and you were the one that when somebody was having a problem, when they were going through a divorce or someone had just died or any trouble that was happening, starting to see people that were having mental health issues, all of that component starts to weave in at this point.
Yep.
And very much so within the police force that it was a stressful position. Yes, I wasn't a police officer. I was on support staff, but yeah. But, so there was a lot of mental health in the retail component, but it really stepped up a notch when I was in the police force. We would have to look at the major incident report every morning that we went in to see what significant incidences had happened, what police officers were involved in terms of what might be an issue for them. Years ago in England specifically, the police officers would go out for a beer, they would debrief and chat about what had happened, and that was not considered so politically correct at that point. They'd got rid of the things like the officer mess and that kind of stuff, those rooms. So police officers were going home having not had any form of debrief from incidences that they'd been involved in and witnessed. So we had to monitor that. And to give you an example, I had a particular police officer that was going through the ill health retirement process, and his wife would call me. I had at least 4 months where every Friday afternoon at around 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she would call me and she would say, has your director retired him yet? Of which I would say, no, it's not gone through yet. So she said, like, he's talking about committing suicide again. So
Oh,
if he commits suicide over the weekend, you'll have his and mine on Monday morning. And that was the reality of what I was working with in terms of level of mental health and having all sorts of significant things of people making hoax bomb calls from police headquarters, like actual members of staff and different members of staff raping other. So we're talking big. And when you are involved in the police force, you see a world that is not what the majority of Joe public would even know exists. So you do, unless you're I think, in the emergency services, you don't see
Yeah.
that stuff. The majority of us don't. So at that point, yes, I was dealing with a lot of mental health issues.
Issue for sure. Yeah, that's heavy. That's very heavy to have to deal with that. And two, the way it sounds, you were in a position too where you didn't have, at least on the job, you didn't have an extended amount of resources for yourself to support that. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. There was very little. I can remember one of my superintendents phoning me and saying, the police officers on their way up to headquarters, under no circumstances do you go out to reception. You must be escorted with a police officer. There were not threats to life, but there were points where,
Yeah.
it was questioned basically because of the way that some of the officers were really wounded by what they were exposed to, and because there was not the release mechanism that used to be in place historically for police officers to debrief.
Yeah.
And I've been out of the police force a long time, so I don't know now what they are doing, but at that point when I was working for them, there really wasn't much in support for them, and then equally nothing really in support for us. So I was very much just winging it and working it out myself in how I supported people.
Yeah. Wow, that's a lot. And I'm looking at it from the perspective of being that little kid, having to experience that mental pressure early on, and then trying to become the people pleaser over the years to get yourself through, to get that fulfillment within inside you. And then now you're in this position where you thought it was going to be a dream job and you're still trying to please, but yet the weight of everything that you're dealing with is just literally soul crushing in a sense. And I can only imagine how mentally stressful that is. At this time, was your husband seeing this amount of stress on you, and how is he supporting you through dealing with that?
Oh, look, he's always been my rock.
Yeah.
Basically, for my whole life, he's always been there and always supported me. So, at that point, we were looking at maybe starting a family, and it was like, there's no way were we going to bring a family and for me to continue to do that work. It
Okay.
just was not. Yes, I could have worked part-time, but I just didn't want that environment. Bless him, he supported me to do yet another career change. So here we go on another pathway.
All right.
And I was studying my Institute of Personnel and Development, Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, and then decided that I would do a massage qualification. Now, I
Okay.
had no idea where that was going to go, but I suppose that was in deep in me, if that creative, that need to do something with your hands
Yeah.
kind of component. And that, yeah, because when you're sitting at a desk and there's just no creative outlet whatsoever in terms of being in that kind of human resources type position, nothing at all.
Yeah.
So yeah, so when we were at that point of thinking, okay, we want to have a baby now, I was like, okay, I need to do something different. Yeah, so this is where I fork again. And I did the massage qualification, as I said, absolute chalk and cheese for studying two different things at the same time. And I had no idea where it was going to go, but I knew that also I had some fertility issues,
Okay.
which Again, in hindsight, I know my fertility issues are going to be connected now
Got it.
to early childhood and so forth. But I ended up, I'll snapshot it because otherwise it becomes a long-winded story. So we get to the more juicy bits.
Cla-
Okay. All right.
Classic.
So yeah, so I'll give you a little bit of a snapshot because obviously we want to get to the more interesting information. So I started studying reflexology after I finished my massage qualification because I'd heard that it was good for fertility, and I did. I fell pregnant 2 months before my fertility treatment.
Oh,
But after that, I was told no more treatment. And as I said, I'm going to fast forward quite quickly through this, but basically, I had a really great pregnancy and birth was a disaster. I had very long labour, transferred from a little cottage birth centre to the big maternity hospital in an ambulance. I ended up with a relatively instrumental free delivery, but I still suffered nightmares and flashbacks as
wow.
a result of that
Okay.
because and it was very traumatic. Both it impacted both myself and Martin, my husband, quite substantially. And this is where again where the massage, the reflexology shapes then is I questioned why that made such a difference to help me get pregnant, but I couldn't have it. And I ended up specializing in complementary health for pregnancy and
Yeah.
undertaking further courses, which meant that there wasn't that, oh no, you can't treat because it's not appropriate. So that's where when I gave my introduction and people were probably thinking, what the hell's this got to do with art? There is connection because all of those manual therapies were me giving a creative kind of outlet. It's not the same as creating an art piece, but it combined the work with me being able to do manual therapies with my hands, but also going back to the same thing of helping people.
Yeah.
So there's this commonality theme that kind of continues through where we're at.
Yeah, for sure. And the other element too of what's playing out here, and the reason I was very much interested after we had that initial conversation prior to setting up the date was the fact that how your community echoes of birth plays into the fact of how being in the womb has literal imprints on your life throughout your entire storyline. And I understand that from dealing with intuitive healers that I've worked with after years of working in psychotherapy and cognitive therapy and different things like that for my depression and anxiety and those types of things, even the attempted suicide that I'd had. Once I started working with an intuitive healer who was able to walk me through going back to things that may have been birth related or prior to, then the understanding started to come into play. And so that's where I think your initial reaching out to me was spot on in terms of we thought it was going to be a good fit. And I absolutely, after our conversation, I was like, yes, let's do this. Because for the audience, even though there's an art part of this, what we're going to end up talking mostly about is the mental effects and mental health aspects of what takes place. And I think that's going to be just as valuable as talking about the art elements. So, as you've gone through this pregnancy, you're having these nightmares and the stress of it that affected both you and your husband. What is the next thing that you step into to try and start resolving some of that or figure that out of why that happened that way?
To be honest, at that point, we didn't. There wasn't
Okay.
any. So my resolve, I say maybe there isn't. My resolve was I undertook specialist training
Mm,
in that complementary health in order to be able to help people get pregnant and then have easier birth experiences.
gotcha.
So
Okay.
I suppose there was a component to that. That's why I did the specialist, because if the treatments had helped me get pregnant, why couldn't I have had them through the pregnancy? Maybe they could have made a difference to the birth. There was that. But when I had my second daughter, so it took me four and a bit years before I had my other daughter, because those birth memories, I can remember doing some of my training and kind of having to leave the room and pop into the toilets and just trying to contain the emotion because it felt so raw watching births and the trauma was really there. And when I had my second daughter, I had a home birth. She was a really quick, easy birth. But again, and I walked around postnatally for the first few days with a massive smile on my face. But postnatally, I really struggled.
Okay.
So it was like the birth had a degree of healing happen. But postnatally, I really struggled, and I found some very dark places in that postnatal period again, to which I had first time. And first time round, we thought it was because it had been a traumatic birth. Second time round, I still didn't get breastfeeding right and felt very much like a failure. Those same things are playing out, that I didn't get something right, I'd done something wrong. But it wasn't until so she was about 13 months old and we moved to Australia.
Okay.
And I knew I wanted another child. And we moved to Australia, and I saw that the maternity system was a bit different here. Not quite to the extent that it is in America, but it sits a little bit. In England, you don't have a very big private sector. In Australia, we have a kind of a middle ground between here and the States, between England and the States, in
Okay.
terms of there's public and there's private.
Gotcha.
And the system was really not pleasant. Like, I was seeing clients coming out of it and thinking, this is not good. And actually, can I backtrack?
Yeah.
One of my very beautiful clients in England, I saw her. So I just want to weave back in the kind of the mental health and the police force in.
Sure. Yeah.
So there was a very beautiful client of mine. I saw her for 3 years in total. She first came and saw me just when I'd not long finished my training, and she had been sectioned under the Mental Health Act in England. I'm not sure what the equivalent is for you guys over in the States,
Yeah.
but she had tried to commit suicide about 3 or 4 days after birth,
Okay.
and she was talking about taking her son with her. So she was on antidepressants, mood stabilizers, under a psychiatrist and a psychologist. So the work that I did within the police force helped me to be able to deal with people that had such mental health issues, because I'd already been exposed to it.
Yeah.
And through the work, I was able to help her actually get out of seeing the psychiatrist and come off of the antidepressants. She was then seeing the psychologist in the day before she came and saw me in the evening. And there's the reason I'm bringing her story into it is because if I'd have known what I know now when I was treating her all those years ago, things would have been different. So I'll link back to her as we move through the story.
All right.
But yeah, I ended up attending her birth and seeing her postnatally until we came to Australia. All right, back to where I was. My daughter, as I said, easy birth. We moved to Australia, but with her, I still struggled. And when I saw what it was like in Australia, I was like, I want another one, but I can't do this. I'm not stepping foot in our maternity hospitals in this country. It's not happening. So we got to the point, by that point, my second daughter, I became an international board certified lactation consultant. I was heavily involved with the Australian Breastfeeding Association, very heavily involved with the Australian College of Midwives, often the only one that wasn't a midwife involved in the work. I, again, was throwing myself into things, again, lots and lots of work. And we got to a point where I was like, okay, I know I want another one. If it's going to happen, it will happen. But this was 9 years after my second daughter.
Okay.
So
Oh,
very big gap,
yeah,
very big gap. So that shows you how I didn't want to go into the system, that it
right.
took me 9 years. So first of all, just over 4, and then secondly, 9. And his birth, so this is where the in utero stuff comes into play. So
Okay,
my first daughter was my complementary therapy baby. My second daughter was my lactation, and my little boy, he's my psychology
okay.
baby. So we were building our own home, and our builder went into liquidation when I was 6 weeks pregnant.
Oh no.
So major stress. My neighbours were phoning me and telling me they're ripping down the scaffolding. All the tradies are here. They're ripping everything out. They're taking. So for the whole of his gestation, from 6 weeks to when he was, I think he was 3 months old when we finally moved into our house, it was full of litigation and insurance battles that were incredibly stressful. I remember being 6 months pregnant, knocking down brick walls of our house because we needed to do something. We tradies trying to find somebody else to take on the house after it had been done. And we now know that there were things done to the house. So as a result of the builder going into liquidation, we had lots of insurance and legal battles. Tradies were coming, taking things, and I was at a point of being six months pregnant and supporting to knock down walls, because the tradies that this guy had got, because he was already going under, was getting all the dodgy people, not the really good stuff. A lot of what we were finding was actually been done inaccurately. We were having to take walls down ourselves, and it was just a big disaster, Rich. It was incredibly stressful.
Right.
But I went on, I had another home birth, and easy, a little bit longer later, but still absolutely easy. And in fact, my midwife didn't even make it to us.
Wow.
Hubby was quite happy. He was saying, I got to do midwife, which is
Right.
quite cool. I had my mum there. I had my 2 older girls there. Quite substantial for them to be able to see that. But in the a couple of weeks after, he'd started to lose weight. And my mum said, no, he's fine. And I said, no, I know. I can tell he's lost weight. And basically, he continued to lose weight. So he went from the 85th percentile to the 5th percentile in terms of the weight graphs
Oh,
in
wow.
6 weeks. So absolutely substantial. And hubby was saying to me, what do you see? Put your LC hat on. And I'm like, but I'm the mum. And he's like, put your hat on. What do you see? And I was basically seeing a baby that had severe food intolerances. And I said, it's almost as if he's anaphylactic,
Yeah.
or he's got celiac disease. Now, in terms of babies, you generally don't get anaphylaxis, and you certainly in literature don't get celiac disease at that point in a baby's age.
Yeah.
But we saw a top gastroenterologist in Sydney Children's Hospital, and he said, you've clearly worked it out, go home, you've worked out what was wrong. And basically, I took out of my diet foods that said may contain traces of dairy and gluten. So I was already dairy and gluten free, because I'd worked out that my body was in quite a state of inflammation that actually taking those foods out had made a complete difference to how I functioned.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so we're talking about foods that said may contain traces that were then passing through breast milk. So there was nothing in literature that would explain that, nothing. But yet, when I took that out, he improved and his weight regained. So I kept questioning what's the mechanism behind this? There's nothing in literature. And I listened to a webinar where somebody was talking about the pre and perinatal somatic sciences, and or sometimes called pre and perinatal psychology, and how what happens to you in utero at birth and the early postnatal period influences you. And this particular lady was talking about food intolerances and a connection back to in utero. So out came my embryology book, and I made the connection that at the point that the builder went into liquidation at 6 weeks, that's when the primitive gut starts developing in embryological terms.
Oh, wow.
So his gut matured for the whole period while he was in utero under extremely high levels of cortisol and adrenaline, and basically made it hypersensitive. So that explained. And for me, then, when we start connecting all the dots back to everything that I've done, there were times where with the complementary health, I'd be working on somebody and I'd think, there's a missing piece here. This isn't working. What is it? Same with lactation. And it was like, although a lot of my modalities overlapped each other, when I found the somatic sciences and essentially what we term as birth imprints,
Yeah.
it was like somebody drew a big circle around the outside and filled in every single missing gap. So then if I go back to my beautiful client, I said I'd refer back to her.
Yeah.
She had, I can't disclose too much, obviously, without talking about private and confidential information, but she was substantially abused as a child.
Okay. Yeah.
Her mum was a prostitute, and she was often sold to paedophiles, very young age, and was abused substantially. And she would come to me after the psychology appointments with physical sensations within her body. But she was only ever in talk therapy. And what we know now, and I still have a connection with her, and she has done somatic work now. But at that time, it was around, but very poorly known about. What she was experiencing back then was her nervous system and the information that from such an early age that was held within her body. And the reason that she struggled with as much as she did was because what we understand is when we are conceived in utero, birthed, and those early periods, everyday things within our life can trigger those memories. But the closest we will ever be is when we're back in that birthing room. So for her, becoming a mother, and the reason she was looking at that kind of suicidal tendencies was because the overwhelm within her nervous system was so substantial, and how she had been mothered was so traumatic that she couldn't do that to her own child and had to take them both out of the equation.
Yeah.
You can see all of these things now, and just talking about that, I know you can't see it, but I've got goosebumps, because when you make those reality checks and you understand and you start to work out what actually makes somebody tick.
Yeah.
People don't behave the way they do out of malice or because they are a bad person, or they behave the way they do because of what they experienced.
For sure.
And what has been held within their nervous system, especially in those earlier days. And when if I link that back to my own experience, the reason that I struggled with the birth the first time was that my daughter's birth mirrored the way that I was born and the way that my mum was born.
Wow.
So we were all posterior babies. My mum was a forceps delivery. I was a forceps delivery. Eleanor narrowly escaped it because I pushed her out. So I trying to very much change these into, so this is where we start moving into intergenerational patterns.
Yes.
So not just what happened to you at your birth, but what is carried from generations.
Yep.
And we know that, for example, my daughter as an egg in my body, as an embryo, was carried in my mother. So my daughter's eggs, all of my kids, the egg that was inside of me when I was in my mother's tummy, they were epigenetically influenced by what my mum did while she was pregnant. So there was that kind of connection. And for me, although with the home birth, I was able to very much change how I felt and went on to have easy birth. So I broke that intergenerational imprint. It wasn't until after I'd had Leon, had 3 very troublesome postnatal experiences, that I was then able to find out it's not that I was a bad mum. I couldn't cope with being a mum. Why could I not do all of this? It was because I was in the closest situation to we would bring it right the way back to when you asked me what was my early life like.
Yeah.
Constant arguments. I never slept because of my birth experience. And because I had the dairy intolerance and I was fed formula right from the very beginning, which is dairy, I had pains in my head because of the forceps delivery, pains in my tummy. So I cried, and parents, neither of them coped. And I ended up in my somatic body, caused them to break up
Yeah.
because I was a difficult child and I wasn't to their liking. I wasn't well behaved. I wasn't conforming to the acceptable standard of a good baby.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the information that I had a feeling was going to come out that is highly important for the audience to hear and then potentially recognize that, whether it's within themselves, friends, family, siblings, all across the board. These things, and it's fortunate that it's been becoming more popular over probably the last decade to 15 years that this information is coming up to the forefront of conversation because it's finally drawing lines back to origin stories and is able to let people have an understanding of what may have been taking place that they couldn't figure out. And when they hear this, they're going to be like, oh, that makes all kinds of sense. And again, so grateful that we're able to get this scheduled and have this conversation because this information is very important, I think, in living and moving forward.
Yeah, look, it certainly made a difference for me. And like I said, with my clients, it filled in all the gaps of where I perhaps couldn't get things to work the way that we would like it to work. And it filled in those missing gaps, but it also filled in those missing gaps for myself. Understanding what made me tick, going beyond the kind of more childhood component. One of the reasons why, although I was able to heal the birth experience, one of the reasons why I believe I struggled so much postnatally was because when I was born, I was premature. I was taken straight away. I didn't get to see my mum. I was taken to a different maternity hospital because they didn't have neonatal care. I wasn't held for 5 days. I wasn't given the opportunity to breastfeed, went straight to formula. So for me, those early postnatal days were very raw. And then when you then go home to an environment where, because I was communicating, like I said, the fact that I'd been a forceps delivery, the fact that I had been fed formula and I have a significant dairy intolerance, and I was communicating pain, I was communicating about the fact that I'd had a difficult birth, I'd been separated, my world wasn't safe
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
that respect. And no one was, not, and not through fault of my mum, because she reached out on multiple occasions for people to help. And one of their solutions was to put whiskey in my milk to try and make me sleep. Crazy as it is
Yeah.
back then, what they would have done, and didn't really give her any support when she was actually reaching out for help. So you can see how these things, and that means that now, with that understanding and knowing that I carry those imprints, I'm able to have a different level of empathy for myself. But
For
when
sure.
you don't have that understanding and you've got all this confusion and these feelings and you have no understanding of where they're coming from, and feelings of self-doubt, self-worth, you know, that you're not, if I think about the things, I wasn't good enough, then they manifest in everything that we do in our everyday life. And then this is where we get the mental health issues, we get the depression, we get the suicide, etc. So, you know, when we understand the imprints that we carry, and we don't need to understand them to an extent that we go back and relive any of that. But what we can do is understand, okay, this happened to us. This is a typical reaction that comes from that experience. Therefore, I understand why I do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. With this new realizations that have come to you, and at this point in your working career as well, dealing with all of the frustrations from the build, all the issues there that you're going through, what is the mindset in terms of, okay, this is what I think I want to do moving forward? Is it you starting the private practice scenario at that point?
So private practice, so Mumabuba I have had basically for 21 years now. So that was born as a result of the birth of my first daughter.
Oh, okay.
So what I've done in private practice is I have initially, as I said, she was my complementary therapy baby, so I specialised in complementary health. Then my second daughter, birth was okay, used all the complementary therapies, but postnatally I still struggled and I had issues with breastfeeding. So that was how she became my lactation baby. And then 9 years later, my little boy is my psychology baby, because I was able to get most of the other things obviously broken intergenerationally, but I still struggled postnatally. And it was like, why? And that's obviously, and he struggled because of the imprints that he'd had with all that stress that I explained in the pregnancy. So when we understand all of that, as I said, that was the point where I was like, okay. And during COVID, we questioned a lot of what we were doing. And I think, as many people did, there was a realization of this is a bit crazy.
Yeah.
We had quite significant lockdowns being close to Sydney. And didn't go out of the house for something like 9 months. So for me, one of the triggers that came up as a result of my early experiences was I couldn't wear a mask. And I realized I wasn't one of these people that was rebelling against anything. I physically had panic attacks at the thought of wearing a mask. So even now, just talking to you, I kind of want to demonstrate, but I know I can't put anything across my face.
Yeah.
So even as a kid, I struggled to go under bed sheets and things like I could not have that kind of material over my face. And I understand now, having somatically listened to my body now, why that is. And going through something like COVID, where everybody was wearing masks, and if you didn't wear a mask, you were considered somebody that was just rebelling against everything and dangerous, etc.
Yeah.
So for me, the imprint of having something over my face actually meant the potential of death.
Yeah.
So therefore, I was back in that, reliving that situation that I'm being told X, Y, and Z. But even scrolling Facebook and social media, people were commenting about those not wearing face masks. So I physically did not go out of the house for 9 months because I could not put a mask on.
Wow.
So you see, but I didn't know that at the very start.
Yeah.
And my nervous system went, hey, I put on huge amounts of weight. It wasn't because I was doing anything different, but my nervous system went,
Right.
okay, we need to protect ourselves from this because we know that this is risky.
Yeah.
It wasn't in the way that my body was interpreting it. Obviously, there were other things going on, but that shows you the power of when something is triggered,
Yeah.
what that does to our system. And it's quite significant.
For sure. And again, ironically, I was the exact same way when that happened. I had got myself to the point of being able to consciously realize when I was in a state of anxiety that I needed to breathe and I needed to do breathing exercises. And when that came up, I was like, oh no, there's no way I can wear a mask. Fortunately for me, to an extent, I was able to get a doctor's note that stipulated that was the case. And even though it was suggested that I do wear the mask, it was understood that because of those issues that I have, that I would be exempt from having to, because we, in the States, there was a clause for medical issues. You could be exempt. I couldn't handle it either. I couldn't handle having something over my face. There's a few times where I was able to do it, but it was a quick in and out type situation. And I just stayed out of scenarios where I was going to have to potentially deal with that a rebuttal by any business owners or anybody else that I was surrounded by. So I completely empathize with that and understand that to the nth degree, what that situation created in you and I, as well as many other people. It was a difficult time for sure. With this point in life at where you're at in the storyline, what is the next thing that starts coming to mind moving out of the pandemic in terms of what you're thinking you're going to be doing moving forward?
Yeah. So my little boy is 8 now.
Okay.
And obviously I started studying pre and perinatal, the somatic sciences. I didn't quite, so I was fairly early in my understanding of that in terms of when COVID arrived. And then obviously I worked out what was going on with myself and studied it more. And at that point, when we started coming out of lockdown, so Martin was the director of research at one of the major Sydney universities, and he was traveling 2 hours to work and 2 hours home again on the train. And he then swapped to the car because trains weren't operating quite as much. And we were questioning why we were doing that. So what we ended up doing was selling our house and buying a couple of caravans and basically moving up the east coast of Australia. As I said, we were originally just south of Sydney. Now we're in the Whitsundays, which for those who in the States that may never have heard of that, we are in North Queensland, right on the Great Barrier Reef, which is, for a little English born in London lass, so to think that I'm now living right next to the Great Barrier Reef is amazing. But anyway, I digress. In that journey that it took us for 6 months going up, Martin had given up his job and we were like, okay, what are we going to do? And I said to him, I want to bring, because everything that I had been studying, I'd actually been studying through America and some of it through the UK. There was nothing here. There's snippets of it, but most of the study was either, as I said, it was either America or the UK. And I said, I want to bring that here. I don't want to, I either had to attend anything live to interact with people through the night,
Right.
or I was always watching replays. And you lose that when we're talking about something that's so powerful, having that human interaction. I felt very isolated here. So that's where Echoes of Birth came into play, because we wanted to be able to spread that initially to Australia and New Zealand, so that because we're time zone wise so different, that we wanted to be able to give people the opportunity to find out about how that could be influencing birth substantially and make a difference to people's birthing experiences and then the generation of babies thereafter.
For sure. What did your husband at that point decide that he was going to do since he's no longer doing any of the design work?
He'd seen the power that it had on myself and understanding. We can see with my first daughter, when she did her final year 12 exams with around the COVID time, and she
Okay.
ended up with some special provisions because she couldn't actually, so her imprint where she got stuck actually just physically sitting in an exam environment. She'd had a couple of incidences prior as well that ended up meaning she really struggled. If she's get tangled up in her bed linen, for example, she freaks out, really freaks out. So, we could see the imprints that were happening in all three of our kids and the power that it had on myself. So Martin was full in. And so we do Echoes of Birth together.
Okay.
It is a joint business.
Got you. And what kind of role does he take in terms of that?
So we have very different skill sets, although he's come with that art background. We created our logo and everything. We didn't need designers for that.
Okay.
But he's very good from an articulation point of view when it comes to writing, whereas that sort of dyslexia that's always been told I was no good enough creeps up every day. That's not my forte. But over the last 2 years that we've had, just over 2 years now that we've had Echoes of Birth, he's very much been sitting alongside me and working behind the scenes. And then he would come in and he would question things. He knows nearly as much as me now,
Okay.
and in terms of knowledge. We've been training health professionals over the last 2 years. Now, this year, we're turning our focus to parents. And the course that we're putting together at the moment, or more of a program, his input is just as significant as mine. He's vicariously learnt through the last 2 years of training health professionals. He's essentially been trained as well. And then because of the support that he's given me and going through the process with me discovering it, yeah, he's pretty close in his knowledge to where I'm at. So it's a
That's
good part.
fantastic. Fantastic. One of the things that we had mentioned in our very first conversation was that you saw some opportunities that were coming back into play to integrate some of your art into what you guys were doing. Can you explain a little bit about what that was and how that came to reappear for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I know it's not the same, but for me, manual therapies in terms of body work is still allowing me to create something or to create. For me, it's not creating a piece of art, it's creating an environment that allows somebody to heal.
Yeah.
So somebody might create a piece of art that puts their work perhaps into emotion into that work.
Yeah.
I can bring a more regulated nervous system into the work and allow somebody to heal. So it's not quite the same, but I feel there are similarities that I can draw on between the work that I would have done as an artist to what I do now. That said, One of the things I wanted to do, and I trained quite a few years back now, and that is with a company in the States. I trained in what's called birth art. Now,
Okay.
it's not necessarily art in terms of what you might create as an artist. What it's doing is using art as a medium to access the right hemisphere of the brain, because we know that creativity aspects are right brain dominant, not left.
Yeah.
Logical thinking components,
Right.
they're right brain activities. And what we have the ability to do through that, through the medium, so I walk them through a meditation and then get them to basically put on paper with chalk pastels what visuals, colors, symbols
Yeah.
come to mind. And what that does is that enables them to access things within the subconscious that they might not necessarily have known, because they're putting themselves in the more logical thinking brain most of the time. And what I do is in childbirth education, I base it all in right brain. So it's much more doing, because birth and the breastfeeding and the first 3 years of a baby's life, they're all right brain. They're all right brain activities. So how I've brought the art in is in part of that childbirth education, understanding, bringing in that subconscious processes that you might not be able to access under normal circumstances, and using that as a tool to help with somebody's birthing and postnatal experience. And we're doing that within, I do that in private practice, and we're also bringing components of that into part of the workings out in relation to the echoes of birth and what we're training in relation to birth imprints for parents.
Got it. Yeah. That's amazing. It's amazing to me from the elements of having done some art therapy along with being an artist. I understood with going through the process of it how it would bring things up. And so I can relate to that. And also, too, what I want to point out, and I've done this one or two times before, and speaking with somebody who's a creative that's using creativity to help with the healing process, is that any creatives or artists that are out there that are in something where they may have this internal pull to want to help others, this is a potentially an opportunity for them to step into something using their talents and their abilities that could benefit others in a different way than maybe what they're currently in, that may not be filling their soul with joy or giving them that full emotional experience of just doing art for art's sake. Doing something like this where you're working with art for a healing purpose, it gives you a different fulfillment. And I think that's very powerful because as creatives, even as you're saying, you're creating an environment that is healing, creating a space that is safe. It allows them to open up, allows them to start to feel. Just that in and of itself is a huge thing for a person who is experiencing anxiety on an extreme level, experiencing subconscious reactions on a high level. It just being able to have a safe space is huge in the healing process because you don't always get that in just regular therapies or regular societal circumstances. With the community that you're trying to create with Echoes of Birth, are you seeing that it is being accepted openly, or is there still some disconnect of trying to explain what it's about versus an understanding of what it's about?
That's a bit of a mixed answer,
Okay.
because we have We've been working with professionals for the last couple of years.
Okay.
In Australia, because there was little understanding in terms of imprints and how birth experiences can then replay out back in the birthing room. So the professionals that we've been working with have been midwives, doulas, occupational therapists, trying to think what else have we got, cranial sacral therapists, other manual body workers, some psychologists. There's a broad range, but they've all worked in the perinatal field.
Got it.
So there's been some resistance because we don't know what it's about. We haven't seen it in play. There's this course or this course. I know about this one. People are asking about it, so I'm going to go and do that one. So we did meet with some resistance to some extent,
Okay.
but even in this last 2 years, we have seen a change. If I think about it in terms of private practice, I have had my centre here in the Whitsundays for a year now. Just this weekend gone was our first anniversary. And I've had a number of clients where this has been absolutely 100% demonstrated. But people don't necessarily know. Some people are starting to make aha moments. So, I might reference somebody like Somatic. Now, he is very significant within the trauma addiction kind of world, and some people have heard of him. So then although Gabor talks a little bit about birth and kind of early childhood,
Yeah.
he will reference the ACER study, which I can talk about in a second.
Okay.
His focus is a lot more on general mental health as an adult and addiction, etc. Whereas our focus not everybody has, well, very few people have actually brought it back to the birthing environment and for people birthing again, and that's the difference. So it is out there for people that are struggling in their adult everyday life.
Yeah.
It's merging much more. There's very little for bringing it back into the birthing room at the moment. In answer to your question, a bit of a mix. We have met with some resistance, but we are starting to see momentum growing and growing in relation to the understanding of how those experiences influence us.
Perfect. Perfect. I'm glad to hear that and the work that he's done. Can you go ahead and shift into that study that you were referencing there that gives a little bit of a different look at it?
Yeah. So if anybody wants to, there is absolutely heaps on YouTube around Gabor Mate and interviews that he's done, some really powerful insights. And he is one of those that if any of your listeners want to do a little bit of research, especially as I said around addiction, his attitude is it's not what's wrong with you, what happened to you and what has caused you to behave the way that you have. It's not that anybody is doing anything wrong, which I think I mentioned earlier on in our discussion. It's about the experiences that you had. And we know that, so he's done a documentary, which is called The Wisdom of Trauma. And that's really good. There's clippets in there where they actually talk about the adverse childhood experience, which I'll reference a little bit more in a second. And they actually go to a prison and they get the inmates to take one step forward if they have experienced X, take another step forward if they've experienced X, and keep stepping forward. And basically they found that most of those inmates had so many of these adverse childhood experiences. So just to give you an idea, I've just got some notes because it's easier to remember.
Yeah.
The adverse childhood experiences was a study done many years ago now, but it's been done so many times that the study is so big, nobody can question the outcome of it. There is It's just not possible to question. It has been proven. And it was actually originally nothing to do with mental health. It was actually to do with weight loss.
Oh, wow.
And as a result, they then uncovered all the things to do with childhood experiences. So basically, it looks at from zero, it says zero, but it doesn't include anything in relation to birth. It's basically your childhood to the age of 18.
Mm,
And if you experienced, so there's three segments, there's abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. So under abuse, you've got physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. Under neglect, you've got physical neglect, emotional neglect. And then in terms of household dysfunction, you've got mental health, you've got, or mental illness, incarceration of a relative, substance abuse, mother treated violently, so domestic violence, and divorce. And these have then shown to cause basically most issues in people.
yeah.
So we know that there are things like heart disease is more likely. So they term it that if you have 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And when you've had 4 or more, this is where, so I've got 10.3 times more likely to have injected drugs, 6 times more likely to have had or caused an unintentional teenage pregnancy, 2.5 times more likely to have contacted sexually transmitted infections, 15 times more likely to have committed violence against another person, 20 times more likely to have been incarcerated during their lifetime, 4.5 times more likely to have suffered depression, and 12.5 times more likely to have attempted suicide
Wow.
if you've had 4 or more. And some of the other, because the study's been done multiple times, some of the other information I was able to find. So that was just quoting one of the studies,
Yeah.
and that doesn't include the heart disease, diabetes, because it relates to a so many fold increase in relation to the comorbidities that most health departments have to deal with. There is another study showed 30 times higher for adults of 4 or more ACEs compared to those with no adverse childhood experiences in terms of suicide rate.
Wow. Wow. Though those numbers are staggering in terms of, I would venture to say, the commonality of so many issues that are going on in the world today. That's that's mind-boggling
Yeah.
in a way.
There's some interesting, some of the key people within the kind of somatic world, not pre and perinatal, but the general somatic. One gentleman called Peter Levine, he developed some somatic experiencing. So that's his term that he's coined of identifying and letting out the stored trauma that we hold within our nervous system. And there's a really interesting, I'm happy to send it to you. One of the people that I follow in terms of nervous system regulation is, she talks about how Peter Levine interviewed the Unabomber's mother.
oh wow.
So remember the
Yeah.
Unabomber in the
Yeah.
States? And forgive me, I can't remember the exact details, but there was something along the lines of when he was very young, as in 18 to maybe 3, something around very young. He developed a rash and a condition that they didn't understand what it was. And he was basically pinned to a bed while they performed multiple tests. His mother wasn't allowed to see him. And she describes him as having come out of that hospital and he had gone. She described him as he was no longer the child that he was before he went in.
Yeah.
They have been able to go, okay, so there is a correlation potentially here between that significant, and it would have been an adverse experience, not necessarily in the way that we've just talked about them from a home environment, but having something done to you at such a young age and the if we think about trauma and we think about people that perhaps go to war, it's not about the event, it's how your nervous system interprets that event.
Yeah.
So for him, clearly that changed him so substantially that obviously as an adult, he then went on to do those horrific things. Again, it allows us to not say that what he's done is okay, but have the empathy to understand perhaps what led to that.
And that's the key thing is having the empathy and the understanding that this is what potentially the caused the disconnect within him to have empathy for others,
Yes.
which I think is a huge thing that takes place when trauma is experienced by a child. There's, and this is my intuitive take, but it's that when something is done to them that's harmful or disturbing or traumatic, there's a bit of that empathy that it dissipates. And if that just gets stacked and stacked, then you eventually just lose all of that characteristic. And I would venture to say that again, that's a huge part of what we have in terms of problems within society in general, with repetitive individuals that continue to get incarcerated over and over. It's just a cycle that can't be broken because they're experiencing something traumatic again once incarcerated and they get
Absolutely.
in that environment.
The
Well,
way we treat all of this, from exactly what you said, from somebody that's been in prison, even to somebody that's just at the level of receiving antidepressants, none of it is getting to the root cause of
right,
why the behavior is the way that it is. And all we're doing is further potentially punishing people by putting them in prison and reaffirming perhaps the experience that they had when they were young.
exactly, exactly. That's the thing that hopefully within the next 10 years, if we're being super hopeful, we can get to a place where that understanding of that is at the forefront, to where we can start making some changes to where we're bettering people versus continuing to just amplify those traumas as a society.
Absolutely.
This is very interesting to me because the more that I've done healing work for myself, I'm understanding myself more through conversations like this, through experiences of working with the intuitive healer that I work with, of understanding how, even as you were talking earlier on, the intergenerational elements that are just passed on that we don't even realize. Those things, that information is empowering because it gives you an understanding. And I think the more that a person that is dealing with depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, any of those things, if they're given the understanding of what potentially is creating these responses, these reactions, it opens up a door of possibility, a door of potential healing, gives hope of maybe I can get through another day because I have this new information and it makes sense. That's why I'm so grateful we're having this conversation. Even as we started off, you're like, just stay with us, folks. We're going to get there, even though it doesn't seem like this is going to be an art conversation. But where you've been able to take that creativity from early on and then bring it forward to what you're doing now in creating a space, you're literally painting a room, an environment that is conducive to someone's opportunity to heal. And that's fabulous. With moving forward, what are your hopes of, say, maybe the next 3 to 5 years with what you're doing in terms of getting this information out, getting the work, more eyes on it, that type of thing?
Absolutely. We've talked about the adverse childhood experiences, and I think, as I said, that research isn't questionable. The work of Gabor Mate, there's a cellular biologist called Bruce Lipton who has very much talked about the first 7 years about downloading information, how in theta waves you absorb that.
Yeah.
So we've very much talked about, and I think in the world, the knowledge of those childhood experiences is very much at the forefront. What isn't so much understood, and this is where I would like to see things very much change, is around the prenatal and the birth experiences. Because at the moment, we've just here in, I say here, not in Queensland, but in New South Wales, one of the other states, which is where Sydney is, they undertook a birth trauma inquiry. And then that triggered one in Canada, it triggered one in the UK. And they have very much looked at the obstetric practices and using terms of obstetric violence, etc. And they've done a very good job at analysing that. But what they haven't done, and there's currently research being undertaken at one of the universities that we've been in contact with, and they're like, yeah, you're right, we haven't included that. Nobody has looked at when a woman, their birth partner, even the midwifery team or the obstetric team, they go into the birthing room, they bring their own imprints. And that reflects on what happens in the birthing room. So you can have, so you know how we talked about two people going to war, one might then come home traumatized, the other doesn't.
Right.
You know, what we didn't talk about in terms of the adverse childhood experiences was resilience. So
Okay.
if you've got, so say something significant happened to you, but you've got another member of your family that is incredibly supportive, loves you, and animals, for example, have been found to be if you've got two kids, one lives in a household with X trauma, the other lives in a household with X trauma, both the same, but one has an animal such as a dog or a cat, the other one doesn't. The child that doesn't have the pet will experience more trauma. So we can gain resilience that helps us navigate the traumatic experiences. So it supports our nervous system, basically. And so what hasn't really been looked at, so they're starting to look at and compile a list now of baby adverse experiences, which incorporates the prenatal and the birth component. And there's some research, so another bit that I thought you'd find very interesting, just to give you, and then I'll wrap up what I mean by all of this. So there's been two specific scientific studies that looked at statistical data and the relationship between birth trauma and suicide. And both found that people that had experienced birth trauma were at a higher risk of suicide later.
Wow.
So one of the studies linked teenage suicide directly to birth trauma and said that out of 10 perinatal risk factors, respiratory disorders, absence of prenatal care, chronic maternal disease had the highest prevalence of suicide when compared to the control groups.
Wow.
So each of those had independently 81% of the suicides studied. So for 81%, they had a correlation with those risk factors.
Holy cow.
Is significant. And then the second study, they discovered, and again, I think you're going to find this very interesting. So they discovered that people that subsequently died by suicide were more likely to have exposed to birth complications, and that was subject to twice as many interventions at birth than their siblings, including things like forceps delivery. So they discovered a connection essentially between birth mode and suicide mode. So those that were asphyxiated themselves by drowning, hanging, or gas inhalations were more than 4 times likely to have suffered oxygen deprivation at birth.
Oh my. I was loaded with chills as you were talking about this.
Yeah, I've got goosebumps
Yeah.
myself. Yeah,
Yeah. Holy
yeah.
cow. Holy cow.
I'll just let that one land with you before I continue.
Oh, jeez. That
Yeah.
that's unreal.
Mm.
Unreal. But it makes all kinds of sense.
Yeah.
Makes all kinds of sense. Okay. I'm with you. I'm back with you.
Yeah, all right, you're back with it. You let that one land. Maybe this is a good point. You should have said this at the beginning. Anybody listening to this, if you are feeling your heart race, you're feeling distracted, you're feeling agitated, you know what? Pause it and come back. Go out into nature, have a look around, go do a piece of art. You don't have to, if it's intriguing you, but you don't need to listen to all of this in one go. Pace yourself,
Yeah.
because we are talking about some significant things that could be triggering your readers by listening, your listeners by listening to this content.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for bringing that up. Absolutely. Sometimes I don't consciously think of that because I've been inundated with the information and I've done so much work on myself. I'm not as concerned about things like that because I'm not paying attention to it. So thank you for bringing that up. But yeah, that's a ton of information that is not easily digestible instantaneously.
Absolutely. And this is the sort of thing that previously in our conversation at the beginning, there wouldn't have been, unless somebody experienced a very similar birth, for example, that can be triggering. But this is different. That kind of thing wouldn't have been quite so out there. Whereas this kind of thing, if somebody knows their birth experience and has had some suicidal thoughts, to be able to turn around and go, okay, that explains why I did this. Again, it's not about reliving it. It's about understanding the trauma. And I think for me, what this does is when we can look at people, it's one of the pieces of training that I did was I talked about putting on a pair of glasses and like a magic pair of glasses. When you put on glasses that allows you to see people through this pre and perinatal, the prenatal right the way through to those childhood experiences, if you can see people with these lenses, you can see something completely different. I can walk around, I can see behaviors,
Yeah.
and I can go, that probably happened to them. This may have happened to this individual. Whereas I'm not going, oh God, look at them. Look at the way they're behaving, idiots. I'm going, okay. So exactly, what I said before, I
Yeah.
wonder what happened to them. You can gain a different lens, not only in how you perceive other people, but how you then perceive yourself. And I think that's the ultimate thing here, is that when we can view ourselves with a different lens, then that makes a difference. So for me, the understanding of adverse childhood experiences is out there. For me now, what I would love to see over those years is that we start to have an understanding of the prenatal and birth impacts, and we start changing the maternity system. Because turning around and saying the way that the obstetrician behaved to this woman wasn't appropriate, they did X. Well, why? Why is one person traumatized from that particular obstetric individual and the other person isn't? It's because how their nervous system was wired when they experienced it. So every time we know that cesarean rates, for example, are going up and up. So we are creating trauma at that very particular point that in years to come, we're just going to keep seeing it going up and up. So yes, we need to support individuals in the here and now, but we need to go back to the beginning and we need to change where it's coming from. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. The other thing that I'm seeing here too, as you just explained all of that, was the course of your career as we talked about it, how you were working for the police department and working with the officers and dealing with those situations. You were seeing all of these circumstances and all of the things that were creating these issues for the officers and why that it wasn't getting better or getting any potential traction to make a difference. And then moving on out of that, and then the other things that you've experienced with the work environments where you've been able to see these things, you've had a broader spectrum point of view at society as a whole from different layers and different angles that helped inform you to be able to see these things even more so now with the experiences and work that you're doing, which is it's fantastic. And two, uh, I, it harkens me to some of the quotes and sayings that talk about certain things happen for a reason within your life, and certain things are not necessarily mistakes. They're just things that happen, but they form your resilience and or your aversions to things. Those are things that we can look at and be able to understand moving forward that not everything was completely bad. The more that we know, the better it is for us to understand the possibility of healing and moving forward and helping others even more so at that point as well. And I think that I'm already thinking of all these different people that I want to share it with already before we even finish up here. People that are working in the mental health space, people that are doing somatic work, different things like that. Like I want to get this to them as soon as possible. Is there anything else, Joe, that you wanted to bring up as a highlight point in terms of what we've gone over so far as we might close out here? Is something else to look at and think about?
Yeah, look, I think that the thing that I would, I suppose, want to leave your listeners to take away from this is that whatever they have potentially experienced, and to be honest, most of us have experienced something. It's very rare to find
Yeah.
somebody that has had no adverse childhood experiences. Most
Right.
people have had something.
Yeah.
And if they haven't had an adverse childhood experience, the chances are they've had an adverse babyhood experience. There's going to be impacts, and obviously, then our environment, how supportive our parents are or aren't, or our other relatives, and the environment in which we live, even to the extent of things like the toxins that we're involved in, and how we, going back, Gabor Mate links to people with things like addiction and people being exposed to, with the way that you were born, you are, there's a particular lady who talks about this. And she says, when we did our studies, we thought, so she's a pediatrician, we thought that it was just the lower socioeconomic status individuals. And that was why they chose to do this. And that was why they chose to smoke, or that was why they chose. And it's not. She
No.
said, it is nothing to do with socioeconomic status. It all comes back to those early experiences. But the thing that I would really love for people to take away from this is that you're not broken. Nobody is broken, and you can always go back and heal this. It might take some work,
Yeah.
but having the understanding of what makes you tick, even if it means you still react when things happen, but having that base understanding of what makes you tick in terms of how you were imprinted in those early days, be it in utero, be it birth, or be it in childhood, that you can have that different level of empathy for yourself. And having a understanding of the link between what happened to you and how you behave is the first step in healing with that. and understanding, looking at your body, being able to recognize. You know, one of the things that I teach in terms of resilience when we're looking at somebody going ahead and processing some of their experiences, we're looking at going really back to the basics. Because if you think about simple biological needs of needing to go to the toilet
Yeah.
and being wanting something to eat or drink. We think about this in terms right at the beginning as a baby. If a baby's on formula, for example, then they're scheduled to have a drink at X, Y, and Z times of the day,
Right.
not in between. So if you're thirsty, you don't get something in between.
Right.
We get babies put in nappies. We ignore them, and they actually know when they can give us signs when they need to go to the toilet.
Right.
Let's move to school. You
Oh,
have to put your hand up. You can only go to the toilet. You can only eat at certain times. We go to work. Most people, it's exactly the same.
yeah.
So we are taught to ignore our biological needs. When we're taught to ignore our biological needs, we're not listening to what's called our interoception. So that is the internal communication that our body's saying, this is what we need.
Yeah.
So just being able to do something where you say, sorry to all you listeners, I need a wee,
Yeah.
but I can't go for the minute, but I'm going to physically acknowledge to my body that I need to do that. We all have to,
Yeah.
and sometimes we can't. We might be on a road trip and there's no toilet, whatever.
Yeah.
So doing that starts to create awareness within the body. And then the other thing is getting out into nature. So we know that blue spaces and green spaces are extremely calming on the nervous system. So for your artists, if you're really struggling on creating a piece, maybe go outside,
Right.
go into the woodlands, go to a park and see if something emerges that you didn't necessarily know, or maybe you're at a stuck point with a piece. Take your work to a different environment.
Yeah.
And looking at, so that is our neuroception. So lots of big words coming out here. But when we listen to our body and start to recognize, we can make connections. We don't need to necessarily go back and look at exactly what happened, or we don't need to relive it. In talk therapy, in psychology practices, you might talk about your experiences. You don't need to do that. Sometimes just the awareness is enough.
Right.
The key is that you have the ability to move on from this and you're not broken. Your nervous system has held on to something that you've experienced, and the way that your nervous system responded at that time protected you. And what it's doing is continuing to protect you, even though you don't need that same level of protection now. So what we're doing is we're basically saying to our nervous system, thank you for protecting me when whatever happened and serving me at that time. I don't need that now, and I can let that go.
That was beautiful. That was a perfect summation for this. And I always like to leave the audience with a final parting phrase, and that is listen to your heart and be kind to your mind.
Absolutely.